The spice trade mattered because it turned small, portable goods into strategic power. A sack of pepper or bundle of cinnamon occupied little space but could command high prices in distant markets, making spices ideal for long-distance commerce in a pre-industrial world. That value density changed everything. It encouraged merchants to accept high transport risk, pushed states to protect sea lanes, and made trade cities rich without producing the spices themselves. In kitchens, spices flavored food. In courts and urban elites, they signaled status. In medicine and ritual, they carried practical and symbolic value. Demand was broad enough to stay stable, but supply was geographically narrow, especially for island-origin spices like cloves and nutmeg. That mismatch between concentrated supply and dispersed demand created margins large enough to support complex logistics and multiple intermediaries. At each transfer point, from producer to shipper to broker to wholesaler, somebody took a cut. Over centuries, this turned spice movement into an international system with its own financing, political alliances, and recurring conflicts. So the spice trade was never just culinary history. It was one of the earliest durable engines of trans-regional globalization. Long before Europeans reached the Indian Ocean directly, Austronesian seafarers in Southeast Asia had already built the maritime foundation of the spice economy. By around 1500 BC, ancient Indonesian sailors were navigating open waters between island Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and India. Their achievement was technological and ecological. They mastered monsoon timing, coastal wayfinding, vessel design, and long-range provisioning in a region defined by scattered islands and seasonal winds. This capability solved the first major problem of the spice trade, moving rare products out of fragmented production zones into larger exchange networks. Once those outbound links existed, spices could flow into South Asian entrepôts and from there into wider commercial circuits. These sailors were not marginal actors waiting for later empires. They were early system builders who converted geography from barrier into corridor. Their routes also enabled cultural and demographic movement, visible in long-term developments such as Austronesian expansion toward Madagascar. In economic terms, they lowered transport frictions at the upstream end of the chain, making downstream trade in the Near East and Mediterranean possible at greater scale. Without that early maritime architecture, later imperial competition over spices would have had no stable foundation to fight over. As spice flows expanded, secrecy became a business model. Buyers in Western markets often consumed spices with little reliable knowledge of where they came from. That opacity was not accidental. Intermediaries had incentives to hide origins, preserve informational advantage, and prevent direct sourcing attempts by rivals. Myths about dangerous harvest zones or mysterious origins could protect margins by making supply seem inaccessible. Information control worked alongside geography. Cargo usually passed through many hands, and each actor often knew only part of the chain. A merchant might know the next supplier and destination, but not the full upstream path back to producing islands. This fragmented knowledge reduced transparency and made trust networks essential. Reputation, family ties, and long-term credit relationships became substitutes for formal institutions that spanned all regions. In such an environment, reliable information was a tradable asset. Knowing monsoon windows, port taxes, local conflicts, or piracy risks could be as valuable as the cargo itself. So spice markets were shaped not only by harvest volume and demand, but by intelligence asymmetry. Profit came from controlling movement and controlling knowledge about movement. The classic spice system was not one route but a layered relay between sea and land. Goods moved by ship where possible, then shifted to overland transport where inland corridors connected major political and consumer centers. Indian and Persian traders played major roles in conveying spices toward the Mediterranean through networks that linked ports, caravan paths, and Near Eastern market hubs. This relay structure created repeated taxation and brokerage points. Every transfer introduced costs, but also generated specialized urban services, warehousing, translation, contract enforcement, financing, and risk-sharing. Cities prospered by managing flow rather than producing origin goods. In modern terms, they monetized logistics infrastructure and institutional reliability. That made political stability along key corridors economically decisive. A secure port with predictable customs could outcompete a nearby port with arbitrary tolls. A safer caravan segment could shift route preferences for years. Over time, trade volume itself reinforced these advantages, because merchants preferred established nodes with deeper credit pools and better information circulation. The spice trade therefore rewarded governance quality in transit regions and encouraged states to treat commerce as fiscal strategy. Revenue from movement could finance military capacity, which in turn protected or coerced further movement. In the Red Sea sphere, Aksum and later Ethiopian maritime actors were central to connecting Indian Ocean traffic with Near Eastern distribution zones. Their importance came from geography and capability together. The Red Sea was a narrow strategic corridor where controlling access points amplified influence over wider exchange systems. During the first millennium AD, Ethiopian-linked maritime strength helped structure this corridor as a high-value bridge rather than a peripheral route. Sea transport could move larger volumes more efficiently than many overland alternatives, so maritime competence translated into economic and political leverage. At the same time, these networks were dynamic. Techniques, vessel knowledge, and commercial practices moved across cultural boundaries through contact and competition. Regional actors adapted quickly, and no dominance remained permanent. The Red Sea story illustrates a broader rule of spice history. Route power belongs to those who combine navigational expertise, institutional coordination, and diplomatic flexibility. Ports and kingdoms that failed to adapt lost throughput and tax revenue. Those that adapted captured both wealth and geopolitical relevance. This continual turnover is why spice trade leadership shifted repeatedly across centuries rather than stabilizing under a single uninterrupted hegemon. After the rise of Islam, Arab merchants became dominant across major stretches of the western Indian Ocean and Levant-facing circuits. Their success was less a sudden invention than a powerful consolidation of existing maritime and commercial frameworks. They connected East African, Arabian, and South Asian nodes through merchant communities that could operate across language, legal, and cultural boundaries. Shared commercial norms and flexible partnership structures reduced transaction friction over long distances. Crucially, these merchants managed time as well as space. Indian Ocean trade depended on seasonal winds, and missing a monsoon window could immobilize cargo and capital for months. Effective scheduling, storage, and credit arrangements were therefore strategic advantages, not minor operational details. Arab intermediaries then linked oceanic supply to Levant distribution and onward European demand through layered resale. This gave them leverage over both availability and pricing. Their role demonstrates that trade dominance often comes from coordination capacity rather than simple territorial control. You could own no spice grove and still command market outcomes if you controlled routing intelligence, vessel cycles, and market access points at scale. From the 11th to 15th centuries, Italian maritime republics, especially Venice and also Genoa, became pivotal in channeling spices into Europe. Their strength rested on naval organization, financial tools, and commercial institutions suited to high-risk long-distance trade. They financed cargoes, structured credit, protected convoys, and managed distribution into continental markets. In effect, they converted Mediterranean position into brokerage power over Asian origin luxuries. European consumers paid cumulative markups created by multiple intermediaries, yet demand persisted because spices had both practical and status value. This profitability encouraged concentrated control, but concentration also generated pressure. Rulers and rival merchants disliked dependence on expensive, politically vulnerable chains. As Seljuk and later Ottoman influence reshaped key interfaces, European anxieties about access and price volatility intensified. Even when routes remained open, uncertainty about tolls, conflict, or political leverage was enough to motivate strategic alternatives. The Italian phase is essential because it shows how intermediation can be immensely profitable while simultaneously creating incentives for bypass innovation. Monopoly margins financed prosperity, but they also financed the search for routes that would eventually undermine those very margins. The Portuguese Cape breakthrough in 1498, associated with Vasco da Gama, reframed global trade strategy. Reaching the Indian Ocean by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope offered a direct maritime alternative to heavily intermediated Eastern Mediterranean pathways. Direct, however, did not mean easy. Voyages were long, dangerous, and capital-intensive, requiring robust ships, navigational skill, and state backing. But the potential reward was transformative: fewer middlemen, greater control over cargo timing, and stronger bargaining power in European markets. This changed state behavior. Maritime expansion became a policy priority, blending commerce with military force and diplomacy. Fortified ports, armed escorts, and treaty pressure emerged as tools to secure predictable access. Importantly, older routes did not vanish overnight. Overland and Levantine channels continued, but they now faced competition from an alternative corridor that shifted negotiating leverage. Atlantic-facing powers gained momentum, and trade gravity gradually moved away from purely Mediterranean mediation. The spice trade thus helped convert exploration from episodic adventure into sustained geopolitical project. Oceanic route control became a foundation of early modern power. Dutch expansion later refined this oceanic model by pushing direct access and route efficiency, including the Cape to Sunda pathway into Indonesian waters. Their strategy addressed practical bottlenecks that constrained earlier systems: long relay chains, dependence on rival intermediaries, and uneven control at key ports. This marked a broader shift from participating in existing trade webs to trying to redesign them around corporate state interests. Competition moved beyond buying and selling into standardizing logistics, securing strategic harbors, and influencing supply conditions near origin zones. The consequences were double-edged. On one side, regularized oceanic circuits increased volume and deepened intercontinental integration. On the other, coercive methods and military-commercial fusion intensified inequality and violence in many regions. Still, local actors retained agency through adaptation, alternative channels, and negotiated coexistence. The Dutch phase therefore illustrates both system rationalization and system hardening. Trade became more predictable for dominant actors, but often at greater social and political cost for subordinated communities. The spice economy also expanded across the Pacific through the Manila Galleon route, opened in 1571 between the Philippines and Mexico and lasting until 1815. This route linked Asian goods with American silver and European demand in a single transoceanic circuit. Its importance is analytical as much as geographic. It proves that early globalization was not one westbound line, but a multi-basin system where Indian Ocean and Pacific dynamics interacted. Silver flows affected purchasing power and trade balances. Asian goods, including spices, moved through imperial fiscal structures, and long-distance shipping schedules synchronized distant societies to shared commercial rhythms. Diversified routes also increased systemic resilience. If conflict disrupted one corridor, others could partially absorb demand, though never without cost. At the same time, broader integration intensified rivalry among empires seeking customs revenue, naval reach, and market access. The result was a world where commodity logistics increasingly shaped state priorities. Spices remained symbolically potent because they represented high-value control within this expanding network architecture. Spice routes moved more than goods. They moved techniques, languages, tastes, and institutions across port cities from the Bay of Bengal to the Red Sea and Mediterranean edges. Merchants needed cross-cultural competence to negotiate contracts, settle disputes, and maintain trust over distance. That produced durable cosmopolitan zones where legal pluralism and practical bilingualism were economic assets. Culinary change is the visible legacy, but deeper effects appeared in botany, medicine, religious contact, and urban social organization. Diaspora communities linked ports through kinship and credit, creating continuity that could outlast regime change. This reminds us that trade history is not only about empires and fleets. It is also about everyday coordination among sailors, brokers, scribes, and dock workers whose routines sustained long chains of exchange. The spice trade generated extraction and conflict, but it also generated shared infrastructures of interaction that anticipated later global commerce. Its cultural footprint is therefore inseparable from its economic one. The core lesson of the spice trade is that control over logistics can outweigh control over production. Producers mattered, but the largest geopolitical shifts came from who managed routes, choke points, financing, and information. Across centuries, power migrated from one network to another: Austronesian maritime pioneers, Red Sea and Indian Ocean connectors, Arab intermediaries, Italian brokers, and then Atlantic oceanic empires. Each transition followed the same logic. When margins were high and access uncertain, actors invested in new pathways. When one corridor became expensive or politically vulnerable, alternatives were pursued despite high upfront risk. That cycle produced innovation, conflict, and integration at once. In modern language, the spice trade was an early case study in supply chain strategy under geopolitical pressure. Its legacy survives in how states still think about sea lanes, critical commodities, and dependency risk. Tiny aromatic goods helped write the operating manual of global trade, and the world economy still reads from that manual today. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.